Hello, my name is Niels Hobbs, and I'm a volunteer here at Minuteman National Historical Park. Today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about some of the pursuits you might have seen happen in a place like Hartwell Tavern, where we find ourselves today. So, as some of you have already heard from the great talks that have already been given, Sarah Vedrani did a really nice overview of what taverns are like in general and some of the myths surrounding kind of essentially how lawless they might have been. A lot of what actually happens in taverns are to some extent shrouded in mystery. For example, we know for a variety of reasons that gaming was very popular in the 18th century. And I'm going to give you a quick overview for the next few minutes of what that gaming looked like in general and what it may have looked like inside taverns in the British colonies. So for example, here at this table with me, I have set up a backgammon board. Backgammon is a game that most of us are quite familiar with today, was incredibly popular in the 18th century. We know this for a few reasons. One, many accounts of people playing backgammon. There are listed in Boston advertisements in newspapers, backgammon sets for sale. And so it's very likely that a board much like this, essentially a folding book format board, would have been common in perhaps in people's houses, and in some cases possibly in taverns as well. Again, it gets a little bit murky when we try to discover what actually is happening inside of taverns. In some cases there were strict regulations against gaming, but very often, as long as it was a relatively genteel, i.e. not a tremendous amount of gambling involved, it likely was something that you could have encountered in many taverns. Certainly the closer you get into Boston, you get into some of the dram shops there where things of a little more ill repute occur, you're certainly going to see some gambling going on. And I'll get to some other examples of the kind of gambling you'd see. Backgammon, very familiar game. The basic rules for backgammon in the 18th century are exactly the same as the majority of backgammon that is played in the United States and in Britain today. And, pieces on a board, you have a dice box, roll the dice, move your pieces around, etc. Hoyle's Games, which was the Bible for gaming in the 18th century, has a whole huge section on backgammon strategy and setup. And so backgammon, again, one of the classic games that we see showing up in the 18th century and was probably pretty common in taverns. So in addition to sort of somewhat more lowbrow or straightforward games, for example, like backgammon, another classic two-player game that we're all mostly familiar with these days is cribbage, incredibly popular in the 18th century as well. But here in front of me is a setup for a very famous 18th century game. It's kind of one of the real classic games of the period called Wist, which is essentially an earlier version of bridge. You have two teams, two partners working with each other, and essentially just trying to lay down the best suits to complete hands. This was definitely much more of a genteel game, but was incredibly well known. Again, for example, Hoyle's Games, which was, like I said, the Bible for gaming in the 18th century. This game book was readily available at bookstores in Boston, so all the games contained in here are ones that certainly would have been known. Wist is sort of the predominant game described in here, including the remarkable amount of strategy that goes into it for a relatively straightforward and fairly easy to learn game. This is a game that probably would have been played by almost everybody, but is a little bit more of a middle class and upper class kind of a game, a little more genteel. The period art often shows men and women playing it together, and to some extent you could do it with gambling if you wanted to. In some cases you could just use tokens to keep track of scoring, or sort of a very polite way of non-gambling, keeping track of the winners. But again, a very classic, awesome, fun 18th century game to play. All right, one of the other games I'd like to show you real quick, again, a game that likely, arguably, epitomizes 18th century gaming as much as any other game out there, and that's the game of Hazard, a game of dice, which is infamous in the 18th century. It was played from the lowest class up to royalty, and essentially is the precursor game to what we now call craps. All it does is just it involves a rolling of two dice from a dice box, and with a group of gamers around placing bets on the likelihood of rolling certain combinations, a great deal of money or vast fortunes, whether those vast fortunes are a handful of farthings, or in some cases 25,000 pounds were recorded being lost at the hazard table in one night. A very simple game, though incredibly challenging and very susceptible to loss of money by the unsuspecting gamer. The person new to town could easily get taken for all of their earnings, all of their livelihood, essentially. Very simple game, a bit of strategy to how the gambling is involved, and that's honestly the trickiest part of it. But again, incredibly fun game, very classic 18th century game played by all sorts. Right, the last game I want to talk about is another equally popular game in the 18th century, well known, but a completely different type of game from most of the others I've talked about. This game is about as low a game as you possibly get. In fact, generally the only people that would play this game would be essentially kind of the lowest riffraff, sailor types, etc. But also children played this game a lot. It's a very simple game. There's some skill to it, but it's all hand-eye coordination. For the most part, this game is, by the way, this game I should mention is called Chuck Farthing. And the reason it's called Chuck Farthing is because literally that's what you do. You chuck a farthing at a hole in the ground from some pre-marked distance, usually probably a bit farther away than I am, but you just have as many players as you have. Everyone throws their coin. Whoever gets closest to landing your farthing into that hole, basically then, and so maybe we'll have other players go. So there's 4 players, 4 coins in, there's obviously a clear winner. Now, the winner of the throw gets to come over, take all of the farthings together, and then from the same distance, or sometimes in some cases closer, a little bit closer distance, throw them all together, and whichever ones might end up in the hole are the coins that that player gets to keep. In this case, I don't get to keep any of these. It would then go to the next of the 4 players. Do the same thing. It looks like 2 are in the hole, so the second player gets to keep 2 of these. Then it goes to the third player, who then throws the 2 remaining pieces. None of them, so then it would go to the 4th player, etc., etc. Incredibly simple game, Chuck Farthing. This game and another game called Hustle Cap, a very similar game where you have the same thing. You have a mark on the ground or on a table that you throw to, and then whoever gets the closest to that mark, whether it's on a table or on the ground, then takes all the coins that are in play, shakes them in a hat. This is why it's called literally Hustle Cap, the Dutch word for hustlen, meaning shake. Some etymologists actually say that's where the modern term of hustle comes from, is this game here. Then you throw that on the ground, and whichever coins are face up are the coins that you get to keep. And then it goes to the next player. Again, super simple. These games were known commonly to be played by kids. Period accounts talk about kids playing them all the time. But even, this is one of the few games that's actually well documented to have been played by the Continental Army during the American Revolution. Ezra Tilden talks about gambling and betting a handkerchief that he just bought the day before. So again, very common game. This is so low that it doesn't show up in the Hoyle's Games books that I mentioned earlier. But regardless, there's a lot of great documentation for it. Thank you very much. That's all we have to game with today.